Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to maritime security, as the Indian Navy Chief Admiral observed that we should not view maritime security through the narrow prism of threat containment. The second article is related to death penalty, as a write-up by the former Union Minister for Law and Justice Ashwini Kumar appeared in the newspaper, supporting the opposition to death penalty by Robert Bedinter. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to maritime security, as the Indian Navy Chief Admiral observed that maritime security is not confined to just threat containment. Rather, there are evolving dynamic challenges for ensuring India's maritime security. So we will discuss the need for strengthening the maritime security of India, the issues, the challenges that India faces in ensuring maritime security, the current maritime security mechanism, the maritime security infrastructure, and also a few suggestions to enhance the maritime security for India. This is important in GS3 under internal security, and you can also use this content in GS2 as well under international relations. In the words of Alfred T. Mahan, the destiny of the 21st century will be written on the waters of Indian Ocean. Whosoever controls the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia in the 21st century. Therefore, India has also been taking steps in growing presence in the Indian Ocean region, establishing bases. When you are writing an answer on Indian Ocean region or maritime security, you can draw such a map highlighting India's initiatives in the region. For example, the construction of Sitwe port in Myanmar, the conducting of joint patrol and naval training with Thailand, Malaysia, the modernization of bases in Andaman and Nicobar, giving patrol planes and helicopters to Maldives, the exporting of patrol boats to Sri Lanka, the establishment of listening ports in Madagascar, the naval communication facility in Mauritius, the work in Assumption Island in Seychelles, the permission for utilizing the port of Duqm in Oman by the Indian Navy, the cooperation with UAE in building of oil reserves in India, the construction of Chabahar port in Iran, etc. Now, what is the need for ensuring maritime security for India? It is of immense significance for ensuring national security and territorial integrity, because India has a long coastline of more than 7,500 kilometers. India has close to 1,200 islands. We need to protect them from both traditional as well as non-traditional threats, for example, piracy, maritime terrorism, etc. Also, it is of geostrategic importance for us because we are centrally located in the Indian Ocean region and we have a hostile neighborhood, for example, Pakistan. Also, the initiatives by China in building bases all around India. For example, the construction works in Karachi port, Gwadar port in Pakistan, Kyukwayu port in Myanmar, etc. by China. And there are regional conflicts also in the Indian Ocean region. The regional conflicts, for example, in Somalia, Yemen, they lead to regional instability, again affecting the regional peace and stability in the Indian Ocean region, affecting India's maritime security. Also, the maritime security will serve as the economic lifeline for India. For example, 90% of India's trade passes through the Indian Ocean region by volume, 70% by value. Similarly, 90% of India's oil import is coming through the Indian Ocean region. Therefore, we need to secure the sea lanes of communication. The vital sea lanes of communication in the Indian Ocean region have to be secured, and there are diverse security threats in the Indian Ocean region. For example, there are traditional military threats coming from the state actors, for example, again Pakistan, the Chinese establishment of bases in the Indian Ocean region, which affects India's strategic security, for example, the leasing of Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, the establishment of the naval bases in Djibouti by China. Similarly, there are non-traditional threats also, like piracy, maritime terrorism, the terrorism, for example, the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai in 2008. And there is great power rivalry also, which is seen in the region. For example, the establishment of bases and increased naval presence of both USA and China, which leads to Indian Ocean becoming a specter of warfare probably in the future. And there is increasing Chinese assertiveness as well in the region, not only through the establishment of direct bases but also more and more dual use ports, for example in Sri Lanka and Maldives. And we need to protect our national assets also. For example, the protection of the offshore oil and gas fields, the protection of resources in India's exclusive economic zone, both biotic and abiotic resources that will need maritime security. Also, India has leadership aspirations in the 21st century. For example, India wants to become the net security provider in the Indian Ocean region. Earlier, we were focusing more on the security along the land borders of India. Therefore, there was a comparative neglect towards the maritime security. Now we want to correct the same. For example, the Sagar Doctrine, security and growth for all in the region, through which India wants to ensure that all the littoral countries of the Indian Ocean region are able to enjoy the low hanging fruits in the region, while India functions as the leader by becoming, for example, the net security provider, being the first responder for the disaster relief operations, etc. But there are certain issues related to maritime security. For example, the growing Chinese presence in the region, the growing Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean region, the construction of bases, the construction of ports by China in the region like Gwadar Port, Karachi Port in Pakistan, the PLA troops constructing roads in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, the exporting of submarines by China to Bangladesh, the establishment of Kyukwayu port by China in Myanmar, the Coco Islands, the leasing of Hambantota port by Sri Lanka to China for 99 years, the establishment of a naval base by China in Djibouti, etc. Also, there are some fundamental issues also for ensuring the maritime security for India. For example, there is no formal definition for concepts like maritime security, coastal security. These terms have not been formally defined anywhere. Additionally, there are multiple institutions in dealing with maritime security for India. For example, there is the Marine Police, there is the Indian Coast Guard, then there is the Indian Navy. But after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, the Coastal Security Scheme defined the domains of these institutions. That the Marine Police has the domain from the coastline to 12 nautical miles, while the Indian Coast Guard domain is from 12 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles, and the Indian Navy has the domain beyond 200 nautical miles. Also, there was the turf war also. For example, the debate of bringing the Indian Coast Guard under the ambit of Ministry of Home Affairs rather than the Ministry of Defense. Then there was the discontent related to the fishermen issues. The fishermen, they are the eyes and ears for the coastal security, for the maritime security. But the politicization of fishermen related issues affects maritime security for India. It affects the coastal security adversely for India. Also, there is inadequate infrastructure. For example, the number of aircraft carriers, the number of nuclear powered submarines, the shortage of manpower, and also India is dependent upon imports related to the marine defense infrastructure. Now, let's have a look at three case studies related to the challenges for maritime security of India. The first case study related to the maritime security breach, that is the 26/11 Mumbai attacks. Why did it happen? Because there was weak coastal surveillance. There were gaps in surveillance which allowed the smaller fishing vessels to infiltrate and easily reach the shores of Mumbai. It was corrected after the attack, and there were intelligence gaps also. That there was intelligence information, but there was a weak mechanism to act upon the intelligence received, and there was a delayed response as well. For example, the delayed deployment of the Marcos, the marine commandos, which led to a prolonged hostage situation and increased number of casualties. So we learned lessons from that, and our strategic response was to put in place the coastal security scheme, defining the domains for the Marine Police, the Indian Coast Guard, and the Indian Navy, and ensuring integration of information among them. And there was the implementation of automatic identification system, the coastal security network to monitor the suspicious vessels. And there was also the creation of the NIA, the National Investigation Agency, a specialized counter-terrorism agency to ensure the investigation, the fast-tracked investigation of terrorism-related cases. The second case study is related to the classical maritime power challenge that India faces. The increasing Chinese presence, the Chinese incursions in the Indian Ocean region. For example, the presence of the PLA Navy, the Chinese Navy, like the building of the ports, the building of the dual use ports by China in Maldives, Sri Lanka, etc., and the string of pearls strategy of China to encircle India in the Indian Ocean region itself by establishing bases in Myanmar, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Djibouti, etc., and the increasing surveillance and espionage activities by the Chinese vessels, collecting hydrographic data, collecting strategic data which will affect India's coastal security and maritime security infrastructure. What is India's strategic response to this? India has also enhanced naval presence. For example, the deployment of P-8I maritime surveillance aircraft, the deployment of the Scorpion class submarines, and also stronger regional alliances. For example, the alliances with the Quad partners, the Indian Ocean Rim Association countries, etc., and the development of the Andaman and Nicobar Command, the modernization of bases there so that India can function effectively. The third case study is related to a non-traditional maritime security threat, for example, the Somali piracy. Near the coast of Somalia, there were attacks on the Indian merchant vessels, which led to the kidnapping of Indian sailors. They were held hostage and they were demanding high ransoms. It created diplomatic challenges for India while we were trying to get them back. It also had an economic impact because it led to the increase in the insurance premiums. Therefore, the shipping costs increased and the shipping routes had to be changed, which led to again higher costs for imports into India as well as higher costs for exports from India. What was India's strategic response? We came up with the anti-piracy operations conducted by Indian Navy. For example, the deployment of INS Mysore, the deployment of INS Shardul in the Gulf of Aden for anti-piracy operations as escort missions. Similarly, the international coordination like UNAFOR and the Combined Task Force 151, the US-led patrolling vessels, etc., and the usage of armed guards on the vessels was also allowed. That is, private guards, private security teams were allowed on the commercial vessels, on the commercial shipping vessels as well. Now coming to the article, the Indian Navy Chief Admiral has observed that there are three currents which are defining the dynamic challenges that India's maritime security faces. The first one is related to the commercial disruption, that the global seaborne trade is showing signs of strain. And this is happening because of conflicts, because of coercion or catastrophe. According to a recent report, the global seaborne trade growth is projected to stall to just 0.5% in 2025. Last year it was more than 2.2%. And this does not happen because of a slowed commerce, rather it is signaling strategic fragility. The second current is related to the transnational turbulence. The seas, they are witnessing a surge in lines which are showing competition, crime and conflict. There is illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing which happens. Also there is arms trafficking, drug trafficking as well as human smuggling, which affects the maritime security for India as well. And the third current is related to the technological acceleration. There is fast paced adoption of AI, big data analytics, disruptive technologies, and it has led to the autonomous systems and commercial satellites being used. They are reshaping the maritime domain awareness as well. So what is the mechanism, the current mechanism for ensuring maritime security for India? Currently, we have a three-tier security grid, for example, as established by the Coastal Security Scheme. First, there is the Marine Police, which functions up to 12 nautical miles. Then there is the Indian Coast Guard up to 200 nautical miles, and beyond 200 nautical miles, there is the Indian Navy. And we are enforcing electronic surveillance through coastal radar chain, automatic identification system, vessel traffic management and information system. The National Command Control Communication and Intelligence Network has been established, and the Sagar Prahari Bal, it protects the naval bases. And there is the establishment of Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region, which ensures that the information, the intelligence is shared with the Indian Ocean littoral countries as well. And there is the establishment of a multi-agency maritime security group as well. Now, India has taken certain steps as well for the indigenization in the Indian Navy for ensuring maritime security. The Indian Navy Indigenization Plan 2015 to 2030, and particularly the Naval Aviation Indigenization Roadmap, which ensures that more than 500 components will be indigenized, including all the fast moving aircraft mandatory spares, so that India is not dependent upon imports in case a war breaks out. And additionally, there is the Naval Innovation and Indigenization Organization. It ensures that there is an interface between the academia and the industry, so that there is the development of the technological skills as well as capabilities for the indigenization for naval defense infrastructure. Now, let's also have a look at some suggestions for enhancing India's maritime security. First, we need to modernize Indian naval capabilities. How we can do so? By ensuring indigenization of the construction of warships and submarines. We can do it under the Make in India program. We can construct more nuclear powered submarines. For example, the INS Arihant class. We can build more aircraft carriers, advanced destroyers, the stealth corvettes, frigates, etc. And we can even have a dedicated fleet of the MRSVs, the multi-role support vessels. This will ensure the Indian capabilities in the amphibious operations. We need to leverage technology and surveillance as well. For example, the integration of the space-based surveillance, aerial surveillance, and also the surface surveillance. We can launch more surveillance satellites under ISRO. This will ensure the maritime domain awareness for India. We can have unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned underwater vessels for patrolling. We can also go for predictive threat assessment. It can be done by utilizing artificial intelligence, by utilizing big data analytics, for example, predicting the piracy operations. And we can secure the maritime critical infrastructure also against the cyber related threats. We can utilize blockchain technology as well, for example, in ensuring transparency in the port logistics, in the shipping logistics, etc. We can strengthen the governance mechanisms and also the infrastructure for ensuring maritime security, like putting in place a national maritime security strategy, ensuring there is a unified tri-service maritime theatre command, so that there are unified operations and the decisions can be taken effectively and efficiently. There can be the building of climate resilient naval infrastructure, so that we are insured against the sea level rise. We can promote international cooperation, for example, cooperation with the Quad partners for ensuring that there are joint exercises, there is technology sharing, etc. The cooperation with the Indian Ocean region nations for ensuring there is capacity building, and also there are joint patrolling missions which are taken up. The Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region can promote the real-time intelligence sharing. We can also increase the frequency as well as complexity of the bilateral and multilateral naval exercises. And we can promote the coastal security and the exclusive economic zone security by strengthening the Coast Guard. The Indian Coast Guard, it can be provided with fast interceptors, more patrolling vessels, and there can be an integrated coastal surveillance system which can be put in place by ensuring the coordination among the stakeholders like the coastal communities, the fishermen, fisheries department, as well as the security agencies. The offshore energy assets also need to be protected. The vital sea lanes of communication also need to be protected. Also, we can build the climate and disaster resilience. For example, the investment in the capacity building for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. We can even set up a dedicated humanitarian assistance and disaster response fleet. We can even pre-position the relief supplies in the vulnerable regions, so that the time taken for responding in case of a disaster can be brought down. If the time taken can be brought down, then India can become the first responder in the Indian Ocean region. Also, we can invest in the green naval technologies, for example, the development of hybrid propulsion systems, the usage of renewable energy for the ports in the shore regions. We can conclude by saying that we can promote the Indian Ocean as an ocean of peace, because it is not possible to enact fences in the maritime border areas. Rather, the settlement of disputes has to be done peacefully by following the international norms in line with the spirit of Article 51 of the Indian Constitution. There is a means practice question also. India's maritime security architecture faces evolving traditional and non traditional threats necessitating comprehensive reforms. Discuss the major challenges to India's maritime security and suggest measures to strengthen the same. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the imposition of death penalty. The context behind it is that a write-up appeared in the newspaper by the former Union Minister of Law and Justice Ashwini Kumar. The article argues for the abolition of the death penalty. So we will discuss the arguments in favor of abolishing the death penalty and the judicial take so far in India regarding the imposition of capital punishment. This is important in GS2 under the topic governance. First, let's have a look at the worldwide approach regarding the imposition of death penalty. The number of countries which have been imposing death sentences worldwide have been coming down in the past 2 decades consistently. And also the number of states which have been conducting executions in the past 2 decades have also been coming down. And the countries which have persistently executed people in the past half a decade or so are mostly located in the Middle East region, apart from China, North Korea, Vietnam, and USA. If you look at the countries which have executed the most number of people, they are China, followed by Iran, and then Saudi Arabia. Now, what are the arguments against the imposition of death penalty? What are the arguments in favor of abolishing of the death penalty? Firstly, the Indian criminal jurisprudence is based upon reformative justice. It does not believe in retributive justice. We do not believe in revenge or retribution. We believe in reform. If the capital punishment is imposed, if the death penalty is imposed, there is no chance for reform which is left. Because the nature of the very sentence, the nature of death penalty is that it is irreversible. It takes away the life itself. There is no chance for reform. Therefore, it is antithesis to one's right to life. It goes against Article 21 as well, as per one section of philosophers. And in the terms of Immanuel Kant, the human beings, they should be treated as an end in themselves. Human beings should not be used as a means to achieve an end. Through the imposition of death penalty, through the imposition of capital punishment, we are trying to achieve an end of a crime-free society. We are trying to achieve the end of ensuring a deterrence against the crimes. But the human being should not be used as a means to achieve another end. Therefore, from the Kantian perspective also, the imposition of death penalty is immoral, it is unethical. Also, in the words of Albert Camus, it goes against the very human solidarity. The imposition of death penalty, the capital punishment, it is against the very basic human solidarity, the solidarity against death. Everybody wants to live, everybody wants to survive. And also, even the Indian legal system, the jurisprudence involves the safeguards against the imposition of death penalty. For example, section 354 subclause 3 of the Criminal Procedure Code provides that the special regions have to be recorded by the justice who awards the capital punishment, the death penalty. The special regions have to be recorded by him. But still, there can be mistakes which can happen. The judiciary is also fallible. If there is a mistake and if the person is executed, if the capital punishment is carried out, then the sentence is irreversible, the mistake cannot be corrected. Also, the argument that the deterrence will be created, the deterrence against such crimes in the future will be created, also lies on thin ground. For example, some evidence has found in the past that the states in USA with capital punishment, there the murder rates were actually higher. There is no credible empirical evidence which says that effective deterrence is created by the imposition of death penalty or capital punishment. And even 88% of criminologists do not believe that the death penalty is an effective deterrent. And even the long periods that the people, the convicts on the death row spend in the jail, the incarcerated people, they develop mental health issues and they require more care. Plus, if India abolishes the death penalty, if India abolishes the imposition of capital punishment, India will be able to attain the moral high ground, and it will be in line with the international human rights standards also. The international human rights organizations like Amnesty International, they also argue for the abolishing of the death penalty, the providing of the chance for reform for everyone, and the cost considerations. That argument is also lying on the thin ground. The argument that the imposition of death penalty, it will save the money for the public exchequer, because the inmates, there also the public money, the public exchequer is spending on them. But this argument also falls flat because it is lying on the morally low ground. Now, what has been the take of the judiciary regarding the imposition of capital punishment in India so far? In the Jagmohan Singh versus State of Uttar Pradesh case, the Supreme Court held that the imposition of death penalty, the capital punishment, is constitutionally valid. It is not violative of Article 14, the right to equality, the Article 19, freedoms, and the Article 21, right to life and personal liberty. The court held that the imposition of death penalty has to be done as per the procedure established by law, and the award of the death penalty by the justice has to be done based upon the circumstances of the case, based upon the nature, the facts of the crime. In Rajendra Prasad versus State of Uttar Pradesh case, the court took the contrary stand by observing that the death penalty is violative of Articles 14, 19, and 21. Although the court held that the imposition of death penalty can be done, but for that two prerequisites are mandatory. Firstly, the special reason has to be recorded as per section 354 subclause 3 of the Criminal Procedure Code by the justice before awarding the capital punishment, and also it can be done only in the extraordinary circumstances. But again, there is no exhaustive list of the extraordinary circumstances in which the death penalty can be awarded. In the Bachchan Singh versus State of Punjab case, the court overruled the Rajendra Prasad judgment, and it observed that imposition of capital punishment or death penalty as an alternative punishment for murder, it is not unreasonable, but it has to be given only in the rarest of rare cases. It should not be the usual punishment which should be awarded if it is available for the justice to award. The principle of rarest of rare cases has to be followed, and for that the mitigating and aggravating factors also have to be considered by the justice before awarding the death penalty. Then in Machi Singh versus State of Punjab case, the court came up with 5 specific categories in which the death penalty can be awarded, the capital punishment can be imposed. The first includes the manner of commission of murder, which has to be considered. For example, if an assassin is hired, there is a cold-blooded murder, then the death penalty can be imposed. Second, the motive has to be considered, the motive behind the crime. If it evinces depravity or meanness, therefore it shows that there is little remorse, there is little chance of reform for the convict, then the death penalty can be imposed. Or if the nature of the crime is such that it is antisocial or socially abhorrent, for example, the murder of the scheduled caste or minority victims, etc., then again the death penalty can be imposed. The magnitude of the crime also has to be considered. For example, the murder of all the members of a family, then the death penalty can be imposed. And the personality of the victim can also be taken into consideration while imposing the death penalty or the capital punishment. In Dina versus Union of India, the court considered the method, the manner of the imposition of the capital punishment or the death penalty. The court observed that the hanging till death by using a rope does not amount to inhuman treatment or barbarous treatment, rather it was termed to be just and fair for the imposition of the capital punishment. In Mithu versus State of Punjab, the court struck down the section 303 of the Indian Penal Code. The section 303 of the Indian Penal Code provided that if there is a person who is already undergoing life imprisonment and then he commits a murder, then the punishment for that will be only capital punishment. it took away the judicial discretion whether the justice can impose life imprisonment, rigorous imprisonment, or the imposition of the capital punishment. If the judicial discretion is taken away, then it amounts to unreasonableness, or it can lead to unfair decision making. Therefore, the section 303 of the IPC was struck down. Now there is a mains practice question also. Examine the arguments for abolishing the death penalty in India and discuss how judiciary has approached its application over the years. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the services sector. As per a NITI report, the services sector employs 30% of the workforce in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy. Before coming to the article, let's take a look at the NITI report. It observes that in fiscal year 2024, about 188 million workers were engaged in the services sector. In the past 6 years, the services sector has added 40 million workers. The employment elasticity in the services sector has been high. The employment elasticity means the percentage change in employment with respect to the percentage change in GDP. The post-COVID employment elasticity for the services sector has increased to 0.63, which is quite high. Therefore, the services sector has functioned as the shock absorber, as the labor absorber, the workforce absorber, and the construction and the services sectors, they have remained as the consistent performance in terms of the employment creation, whereas there has been a laggard response from the manufacturing sector in the employment creation. Therefore, the services sector has come out as the backbone of the non-farm employment, as it is the second largest employment provider after the agriculture sector. Now let's look at the employment share by sector across the world. Across the world, the 50% of the people are engaged approximately in the services sector, and this proportion has been increasing in the past 3 decades. Whereas in India also, the proportion of the people engaged in the services sector has been increasing, but still in India about 31% people are engaged in the services sector, whereas the share of the employment for the agriculture sector has been coming down both globally as well as in India. The report also analyzes the contribution of various subsectors within the services sector. For example, the employment creation majorly comes from the traditional services, like 2/3 of the employment generation comes from the sectors like trade, transport, education, accommodation, etc. And there are certain high value services which contribute highly to the gross value addition, for example ICT, professional services, financial services, but their employment creation is comparatively lower. Therefore, there is a structural imbalance, that is, the high value services, they provide more contribution to the GVA, but they provide lower employment generation. Therefore, there is a policy shift which is needed. The report argues that the workers, they need to be shifted from low value services to the high value services by providing them skill training, capacity building, etc. Also, there is earnings inequality both sector wise and gender wise. There is gender pay gap which is observed. For example, in the rural areas, in the services sector, there is gender pay gap. The women get less than 50% of what men get for the similar role. Therefore, there is gender pay gap. And in the urban areas also, in the services sector, there is gender pay gap, as women get only 84% of men get for similar work, similar role. But there are certain outliers also. For example, information communication technology, ICT sector, healthcare and education, they are outliers. There the women, they are paid similar to what men get, and sometimes the women pay is exceeding that of men. There are state-wise variations also which are observed in the NITI report. For example, the contribution of the services sector across the states is uneven. In the urbanized union territories, the contribution of the services sector is comparatively way higher. In the large states, there is modest contribution from the services sector, whereas in the southern states, it is comparatively higher. But in the northeastern states, the variation is quite wide, with overall lower contribution from the services sector. Now coming to the article, the services employment in India rose to 29.7% in fiscal year 2024 compared to 26.9% in fiscal year 2012. with 40 million jobs being created in the last 6 years itself. But still, the global average is about 50%, and the Indian contribution of the services sector in total employment creation is lagging behind. Therefore, there is a need for structural reforms, fast tracking social protection, digitizing informal worker registration, and formalization of the care services which is needed. While the services contribute over half of the national output, they provide less than a third of the jobs, most of which are informal and low paying. The report also provides specific policy recommendations which can be taken up for increasing the contribution of the services sector in the Indian economy. First, it talks about the accelerating of the formalization and ensuring the job security in the services sector. For that, minimum job standards can be put in place. For example, the contracts, the leave policy, social security, etc. We can safeguard the gig and platform workers by ensuring fair pay, grievance redressal for them, putting in place safety nets, and the digital registration of the informal workers, as well with portable social security IDs, formalization of household based and care services. It will ensure that there is reduced informality in the job creation, and there is improved job quality as well as expanded social protection in the services sector. The report also provides that we need to bridge the gender gaps and the rural gaps. For that, we can develop the rural service hubs and diversify the rural services into healthcare, digital tourism, and green services. We can also strengthen women's skilling in the STEM sector, healthcare, and IT sector, and provide for childcare and safe mobility, and enforce equal pay and promote women's leadership. That will also be in line with Article 39D, ensuring equal pay for men and women for similar roles. It will ensure in the long run that there are non-farm rural jobs which are created, and it will ensure higher female participation and reduce the rural urban as well as the gender divides. The report recommends that we can leverage the technology and the global trends as well for promoting the contribution of the services sector in the Indian economy. For example, promoting youth-led innovation in artificial intelligence, climate technology, healthcare sector, and digital governance. We need to align the higher education with the industry needs and ensure that we can focus upon lifelong learning via flexible skilling models. This will ensure that we are able to harness the demographic dividend and we have a future ready workforce for us. The report recommends that we can foster the regional growth as well, a balanced regional growth. For example, by going for state specific blueprints for employment creation, we can invest in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. We can promote the emerging service sectors in green economy, wellness, tourism, digital education, etc. And we can stimulate the demand for public services as well. This will ensure that there is reduced migration pressure because there will be growth in all the regions, there will be balanced regional growth, and we will be able to integrate into the global value chains as well. The next article is related to diaspora and the diaspora diplomacy and limits of cultural nationalism. This is important in GS2 under the topic Indian diaspora. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the diaspora. What is the role of Indian diaspora? The diaspora helps us in promoting Indianness. From fashion to food, from red carpet to cuisines, they are promoting Indian culture worldwide. And they also provide for investments, which helps in the Indian economy. And they are promoting Indian products worldwide, the vocal for local, for example, promotion of Indian tea, Indian textiles worldwide, which helps us in exporting Indian products. They provide us remittances. About 13% of the global remittances come into India. It contributes about 3% to India's GDP. And it is helpful in diaspora diplomacy because persons of Indian origin, they are at influential positions, for example, Sundar Pichai, Kamala Harris, etc. And there is help in the research and innovation also. For example, the organization of Vaibhav Summit by India to attract the Indian talent, to attract the Indian diaspora into India for research contributions. But there are certain challenges which the Indian diaspora faces. The first one is they are having a heterogeneous nature. There are differential needs for diaspora in different reasons. For example, the diaspora in the Gulf, they need welfare, they need support from India. The diaspora in the wealthy nations, in the Western nations, in the advanced economies, they need investment opportunities into India so that they can invest their wealth, they can invest whatever they have earned in the other countries in India. And there are problems related to regulatory cholesterol. The red tape related to the diaspora has to be cut down in India, and there is protectionism which is faced by the diaspora in some host countries. For example, the nitakat law in Saudi Arabia. Therefore, the companies there, they are forced to employ the Saudi nationals. At times, there are sectarian conflicts also in some regions where Indian diaspora lives. For example, the Shia Sunni conflict in the Middle East, which affects the Indian diaspora, their safety and security as well. Also, they face discrimination, isolation, as well as exploitation sometimes. For example, the kafala system in the Gulf, where the workforce is bound to the employer, therefore, they face discrimination as well as exploitation. And sometimes they are recruited in the conflict zones also. For example, the Indian diaspora in the Israel. Now, what are the steps that the Indian government has taken for safeguarding the Indian diaspora for their welfare? First, the government came up with the Overseas Citizenship of India OCI scheme 2005. Through this scheme, the lifelong visa is provided to the persons of Indian origin, through which they can visit India anytime for any period without any restrictions upon the period of stay in India. There is the celebration of Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, which is done on 9th of January in India. And the Pravasi Bharatiya Bima Yojana provides that the insurance for the diaspora is mandatory for those people who belong to the immigration check required category. For the ECR category, the insurance is mandatory. Then there is the launching of the Madad portal by the Ministry of External Affairs. The Madad portal, which stands for the Ministry of External Affairs in aid for the diaspora in distress. They are provided consular support, consular access through it. The Pravasi Bharatiya Sahayata Kendras have been established, and there is the Know India program as well, through which the young diaspora abroad, they are taught regarding their Indian roots. They get to know about their Indian roots and Indian culture. There is the establishment of Indian Community Welfare Fund as well. Now, coming to the article, the Indian diaspora has been in the spotlight in the past few weeks. The reason being an aggressive display of cultural exhibitionism by a section of Indian diaspora. One section of Indian diaspora has gone for the display of Indian culture and Indian faith, crossing the limits of publicly acceptable behavior in some countries. For example, the immersion of Ganpati statues in the water bodies, the display of Deepavali fireworks in public places. It amounts to aggressively promoting cultural exhibitionism as if it is a matter of community pride, community right. Earlier, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had consciously decided to keep the politics of the persons of Indian origin aloof from India, because it might be seen as the involvement of India, interference of India into the domestic politics of the other countries. But the approach changed. From 1919 onwards, there has been an expansion of the global network of cultural nationalists, and this approach gained momentum from 2014 onwards, especially as the author claims that exactly around this time there has been a rising fear among the US circles, especially the fear of the foreign interference in the domestic politics of USA. For example, the allegations of the Chinese interference, Russian interference in the domestic politics of USA. Even Israel, which usually had a free pass in the involvement in the US domestic politics, has also faced increased scrutiny and resistance. Now, historically, the Indian migrants were considered to be a benign presence, a harmless presence in the USA, because they were followers of all religions, they were so diverse, they were speakers of several languages. But the state sponsored attempts to turn the diaspora into the active members of Indian strategy, they have clashed with a rising fear of foreign interference in the West. Also, there has been a nationalist hype. India does not allow the dual citizenship, but the USA does. India gave partial citizenship rights to the persons of Indian origin through the Citizenship Amendment Act 2003 by adding sections 7A to 7D of the Citizenship Act 1955. This amendment introduced the overseas citizenship of India, offering them lifetime visa-free entry, exemption from police registration, and rights similar to those as the non-resident Indians, etc. The next article is related to Climate Inequality Report 2025. This is important in GS3 under the topic Conservation, Environmental Pollution and Degradation. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few observations of the Climate Inequality Report. It observes that the impact of the climate change will be borne by the global bottom 50% disproportionately. The relative climate losses are highly concentrated among the global bottom 50%. The relative losses for the bottom 50% will be to the tune of 74%, whereas for the top 10%, the relative loss will be only 3%. Not only this, they will be facing climate inequality on three fronts. First, the relative losses for the bottom 50% are the highest and the top 10% are the lowest. Second, the contribution to the emissions for the bottom 50% is the lowest at just 10%, whereas the emissions contribution for the top 10% is the highest at 47%. Additionally, the bottom 50% ability, the capacity to finance for ensuring the countering of the climate change is the lowest at just 2%, and the capacity to finance for the top 10% is the highest. Therefore, the bottom 50%, the globally poorest bottom 50% will be facing the brunt of the climate change on three fronts. Now let's also have a look at the emission shares among the global wealth groups. When we look at the emission share in terms of consumption, then the contribution of the emissions for the top 1% is just 15% to the global emissions. But when we look at their private ownership, then their contribution to the global emissions is to the tune of 41%. But despite this, still about one third of the global energy investments, they are going to the fossil fuels only. This needs to change. Therefore, the report gives certain suggestions. First, it says that we need to regulate the ownership and we need to change the financial flows. For example, we can put in place a fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty so that there is a ban on the fresh fossil fuel investments. Also, the capital needs to be redirected. The capital needs to be redirected towards the investment in the renewable energy sources. And there can be a mandatory accounting also, so that there is transparency, for example, through the central security depositories, so that the investments and the ownership patterns can be monitored. Additionally, there can be sustainability disclosure frameworks which can be put in place, for example, as is done in European Union. There can be a stringent criteria which can be put in place for classifying the green investments so that there is no turnaround. Additionally, we can learn from the case study of the Denmark, which has come up with the phase out plan through the North Sea Agreement. This agreement puts in place a 2050 end date for the oil and gas extraction. There will be no future licensing rounds, therefore, and the oil and gas extraction will stop by 2050. It freezes the sector's footprint and it also bars new investments in the oil exploration and the natural gas extraction so that the climate change can be tackled and the emissions can be brought down. Also, it provides for the compensation and the support for the workers as well as the regions which are affected. The second suggestion is we can tax the carbon content of the wealth. For example, the current carbon pricing is too low. We need to put in place a progressive carbon based wealth tax so that the wealthy can be taxed based upon their carbon emissions, and the tax liability can be based on the carbon intensity of the total owned assets. And the investments, they can shift easier rather than the shift in the consumer patterns. Therefore, the investments themselves need to be controlled. Additionally, the report suggests for the publicly driven decarbonization. For example, we will be left with a choice between extreme wealth concentration, because the climate change will also induce wealth inequality going further if we don't take action, versus reduced inequality via public investment. Therefore, the governments need to step up. They can fill this climate investment gap. The states can function as the investors of the first resort for the high risk projects, because the public investments, if they are taken up, they can be funded through progressive wealth taxation. And the public ownership, it will ensure that in the long run there is no private rent seeking. It will also ensure universal access also, and therefore new sovereign green investment funds can also be put in place. Now, coming to the article observes that the climate change can deepen the wealth inequality, as the share of the wealth held by the global top 1% could increase to 46% from the current 38% at present by 2050, if those individuals were to make and own all necessary climate investments. Therefore, the climate investments, they need to come from the public sector rather than the private sector. If it is coming from the private sector, the climate related investments also, that could also deepen the inequality.
As per the ownership-based approach, the climate footprint of the wealthiest 10% in France, Germany, and USA, it is 3 to 5 times higher than suggested by consumption-only estimates. Therefore, we need to look at the climate-based inequality from the private ownership rather than the consumption only estimates. In the US, for instance, the top 10% account for 24% of the emissions under the consumption based approach, but 72% under the ownership based approach. Therefore, we need to take into account the inequality based upon the ownership based approach. This concentration of emission linked to wealth could be partly addressed via tax on the carbon content of the wealth, as we already discussed. The next article is related to cloud seeding experiment which has been done in Delhi to induce artificial rain and to tackle air pollution. This is important in GS3 under the topic conservation, environmental pollution and degradation. So how is artificial rain induced? First, there is existing moisture in the cloud. Then a chemical is inducted, usually silver iodide or potassium iodide. These seeds, they provide additional nuclei for the droplets to form and the raindrops are formed, which leads to artificial rain. So what is it? It is weather modification intervention that aims to artificially alter the amount of precipitation or the type of precipitation, that is to induce or increase the rain or snow. We want to reduce the air pollution in the NCR region. Therefore, the chemical seed particles, they are used to modify the clouds. These seeds act as the cloud condensation nuclei. Around these, the water vapor condenses and the droplets, when they grow large enough, then they fall as rain. This technique is not new. It is about 75 years old. The particles, they are released below the base of the cumulus clouds that have a warm base, that is the temperature above 0 degrees, while the cold clouds, they are top seeded through hygroscopic and glaciogenic seeding. The cloud seeding agents which are used are usually the chlorides of sodium and potassium and calcium, as well as the iodide of silver. What is the process? A pyrotechnic material together with a burning agent, they are compressed inside the tube and cases, and they are attached to the wings of a cloud seeding aircraft. Then these flares, they are fired through the wings of the aircraft, and finally the dry aerosol particles, the cloud droplets, the raindrops and the ice particles, they are monitored. What are the requirements for a successful artificial rain induction? First, there has to be the availability of clouds. In a cloudless sky, the rain cannot be induced. Second, there has to be an availability of moisture also. Third, there has to be an optimum level of convection, that is instability, that is vertical movement of air. The vertical growth of clouds is therefore allowed. If the horizontal winds are too strong, on the other hand, they may prevent the cloud from growing too tall. There are certain challenges also. For example, the timing is important. The clouds must be targeted in the early period of their growth, and the seeding in the raining clouds will wash out the seed particles into the boundary layer. And the pilot also has to be trained while seeding the clouds, as flying in the upper level clouds can also lead to the icing on the aircraft itself. The next article is related to the special intensive revision of the electoral rolls. This is important in GS2 under the topic elections and salient features of the Representation of Peoples Act. Before coming to the article, let's discuss what are the issues with the special intensive revision. Firstly, it has been alleged that this is exclusionary by design itself. For example, the burden of registration has been given onto the voters rather than the election commission. Secondly, there are allegations that it might lead to a mass disenfranchisement if the voters do not enroll themselves, and it can lead to a decline in the number of voters in the voter rolls. Additionally, it can have a discriminatory impact, as there is an allegation that it might lead to the deletion of more number of women voters and more number of voters from the minority communities. Also, it has been alleged that there is an arbitrary and unverified basis to compare it to the 2003 voter list, that there are allegations whether it is having pristine quality, the 2003 voter list. Also, the documentation is slightly restrictive in nature. The list of eligibility documents which are provided by the Election Commission of India, it is difficult for a poor person to provide them. Also, the due process has also been questioned. For example, it allows the summary exclusion without giving notice, without hearing, without the appeal in case of deletion from the voter roll. Additionally, the cost is also high. The cost on the state exchequer will be the monetary cost, and the cost on the poor will be the psychological cost, being deleted from the voter roll. And the problem which is being alleged, for which the special intensive revision is being taken up, there is little concrete evidence for that. For example, the allegation is that there are foreigners on the pre-existing rolls, therefore special intensive revision needs to be taken up, but there is little credible or empirical evidence regarding the same. Now coming to the article, it observes that the Chief Election Commissioner has announced that the special intensive revision of the electoral rolls will now be carried out across 12 states and 1 union territory. And the booth level officers will be visiting households to get the enumeration forms filled in. This exercise will be different from the special intensive revision of the electoral rolls in Bihar on 3 counts. Firstly, the process is now more inclusive. For example, the enumeration forms have been redesigned to include 2 columns in which the electors are supposed to mention their links through parents or even relatives to the last revised electoral rolls. It was not done in the Bihar special intensive revision. The electors who were not registered in the 2003 revised rolls, they were asked to submit any of the 11 prescribed documents to prove their eligibility. Secondly, unlike the Bihar special intensive revision, where the Supreme Court had to nudge the Election Commission to accept Aadhaar as the 12th document, now Aadhaar will be an eligibility document from the outset itself. And thirdly, on the question of citizenship as well, it is still an eligibility criterion for the voter roll to be included. The Election Commission has now softened its stance. Thank you.